They were fed aspartame, and they were fed aspartame with milk. The milk, as you know, normally slows down the absorption of certain chemicals when you drink milk. If you take aspirin in milk, it'll take much longer for the aspirin to go to work. Well, even though the monkeys were drinking aspartame and milk, out of the 7 monkeys they had, I think 1 or 2 died and 4 or 5 had grand mal seizures. Now, these test results were not satisfactory to G.D. Searle. They weren't going to be able to show these to FDA, saying, hey, look, aspartame, even with milk, caused monkeys to have grand mal seizures.
When we did our double-blind study here at this hospital, we had really a tragic situation which occurred, which I attributed directly to the aspartame. We needed volunteers. We looked at both patients, that is, people who had a history of mood disorder, and we needed some controls, that is, people without a history of mood disorder. One of the people that I used in the study was the administrator of our psychiatric unit, who was a PhD psychologist. And several days into this study, he had an emergency. He had an ophthalmologic emergency. That is, he had sudden bleeding in his eye and a detachment of his retina. He had to be rushed to Cleveland for emergency surgery. His eye could not be saved. He lost the vision in one eye. At the same time, we had another participant in the study, a nurse, who also had an episode of intraocular bleeding, that is, bleeding within her eye. So we had 2 people who, during the course of the study, had eye emergencies.
The bottom line was, here is the most tested product, additive in history, an additive. Now, additive's important because aspartame was approved as a GRAS, G-R-A-S, that means generally recognized as safe product. In which case, unlike drugs, if people have reactions to it, it does not have to be reported to the FDA.
And what I found was really quite frightening, and that was that, yes, there were many, many studies in the literature which did attest to aspartame safety, but they were essentially all funded by the industry, either Searle or the NutraSweet industry or the diet soft drink industry. These were the individuals who sponsored, paid for the studies. There were independent studies, but virtually all of the independent studies, that is, studies which were not funded by the industry, virtually all of them did identify one type of problem or another with aspartame.
And so they got the test results they wanted by manipulating the method. This is not to say that aspartame was safe or that aspartame does not induce seizures, because it does. It's just to show you that the scientific data nowadays is unreliable.
So how you design the study is going to have an impact on the results, and I think that many of the industry-sponsored studies were set up in such a way that the results could be predicted ahead of time and would be supportive of the safety of the product.
Sounds great. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
There is no evidence at the present time that I'm aware of that aspartame in large amounts has a significant effect on brain chemistry.
Can we go through what exactly an excitotoxin is?
Well, an excitotoxin, basically what it does, it's a normal transmitter in the brain. These are chemicals that allow brain cells to communicate. But if it's in even a minute over-concentration in the brain, it causes the brain cells to become extremely excited. And they become so excited, they'll very quickly burn themselves out and die. That was one of the first observations by Dr. Olney, and he gave it the name excitotoxin.
When was the first time that you heard about aspartame? Was it during that investigation with the FDA?
Yes, it was. It was in 1970, and it was an interesting story. I was called by Dr. John Olney from Washington University, who I had been working with on MSG in baby food. We had started an examination of MSG in baby food that led to the baby food industry taking MSG out of baby food. And it was done by the Senate Nutrition Committee. I was the special counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. And we ran hearings on food. And one of the things we talked about was MSG in baby food, because it caused holes in the brains of rats that were being tested by Dr. Olney. And it was Dr. Olney's hypothesis that a substantial amount of mental retardation, 95% of which is of unknown origin, that a substantial portion of that came from environmental insults, chemicals in the environment, food, air, water, and so forth. And he was testing them. And one of them was MSG, and it caused these holes in the brains of mice in his system, and ultimately that led to having MSG taken out of baby food. He called me to say that he'd just done a study on aspartic acid, one of the primary components of NutraSweet, and it was doing the same thing as MSG. And that caused him to be quite concerned about the fact that Cyril Drug Company at the time was planning to use this as a sweetener.
But now, after years of retesting this, most authorities agree, there's no question, that feeding MSG to animals produces this brain damage. It's not questioned any longer, it's a fact. There's even good studies to show that if you feed the pregnant animals the MSG, their offspring has impaired brain function, and when you measure the neurochemical analysis of the brain of the animal, it's impaired all the way through the animal's youth up until adulthood, and they never quite recover from it.
In one of the conferences which I addressed for the FDA a few years back, there was a study with MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is another excitotoxin, it's a neurotoxin problem. And we could not understand why, with the controls, had almost the same number of reactions as the people had given it. But it turned out that one of the presumably inert components in these capsules of products with MSG contained aspartame. So it really was, there was something that even the investigators did not realize was a component of the presumed placebo.
The central mechanism that actually produces the destruction and damage to the brain is excitotoxicity. That's pretty well agreed upon now. The frightening thing is that we're adding tons of these excitotoxins to our food, either in the form of MSG or part of the aspartame molecule, which is aspartic acid, which is an excitotoxin.
Can we talk about the blood-brain barrier and how it breaks down? Like hypoglycemia can be an example of that, and how excitotoxins can pass through that on occasion.
Yeah, the blood-brain barrier is one of the big defenses that the industry always gives. They say, well, these things can't get through the blood-brain barrier. I did rather extensive research in this area, and what I discovered was that there are numerous conditions that we're all subjected to that cause the breakdown of the normal blood-brain barrier. Number one is aging. As we age, our blood-brain barrier begins to deteriorate. It becomes porous. So that anything we eat will pass through the blood into the brain. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, all of these diseases are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Strokes, even silent strokes, produce a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Exposure to certain pesticides, herbicides will break down the blood-brain barrier. Hypoglycemia will break it down. Certain drugs will cause it to break down. Free radical generation will cause it to break down. Well, we know many of the diseases are caused by free radicals, like diabetes. You can have very high free radical levels. Extreme exercise, you produce a lot of free radicals. All of this breaks down the blood-brain barrier. Multiple sclerosis, autoimmune diseases, lupus, all these things are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So we know there are millions and millions of people out there who have, at one time or another, a very porous blood-brain barrier. So when they drink a Diet Cola or they eat MSG, it passes right into their brain very easily. The other thing that we discovered was that even if you had a completely normal, intact blood-brain barrier, if you expose that person to a high dose of these excitotoxins over a prolonged period of time, it will seep past the barrier into the brain.
The same building blocks that are found in all of the proteins that we eat, whether they be bananas or meat or peanuts or what have you, they are found in NutraSweet.
Now, the amino acids are contained in food, but if you have protein, meat, fish, and so forth, there may be 4% phenylalanine in the food, but not 50%. And we simply, biologically, don't know how to react to this flooding of these enormous amounts of amino acids in the body, especially the phenylalanine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's meant to protect against, biologically, against poisons and so forth.
It's also what's called a dipeptide. That is, it is two amino acids stuck together. One of those amino acids is something called phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is the building block for another important neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. So when you take in aspartame, you'll increase the availability of one and you'll decrease the availability of the other. You'll change ratios. And when you do that, when you change ratios of norepinephrine and serotonin, you certainly affect brain function. And this can lead then to mood symptoms, to panic symptoms in some people. It'll affect seizure threshold, which is why I think I saw the seizure in this initial patient back in 1985, and why I saw a lot of seizure activity in people who were taking in a great deal of aspartame.
They knew that this product, aspartame, with time breaks down into a product called diketopiperazine. Diketopiperazine chemically is closely related to a carcinogenic compound that causes cancer in a lot of animals if they're exposed to it, and humans. So they asked the GD Cereal Company to do a separate study with the diketopiperazine. Well, when they looked at this study, they found some shenanigans as well. And one of the things is when you mix up the diketopiperazine with the animal's food, you have to homogenize it so that it's evenly distributed and the animal can't see it and avoid it. Well, I've seen pictures of the feed, and they left it in big clumps so the rats were eating around it, not actually eating the diketopiperazine. There was also evidence that they were giving the diketopiperazine to the control animals. And of course this came out because in the original study they found a 47-fold increase in brain tumors. In the diketopiperazine repeat study, they said, oh, well look, the control animals and the aspartame-fed animals have the same incidence of brain tumors. Well, when the neuropathologist looked at it, said, well, that's kind of strange because now your control animals have a very high incidence of brain tumors that's not naturally found in these mice. And then when they looked at the feed, they found out there were some mix-ups of the feed so that the diketopiperazine was being fed to the control animals. These are the sort of things that's in the Bressler report that the makers of NutraSweet would not like the public to know about, because it's very frightening. You know, when the pathologist, Dr. Adrian Gross, looked at the material as well, very well-regarded pathologist, and he looked at it and he was absolutely shocked. He said it's just an enormous increase in tumors, particularly the brain tumors. And of course that's exactly what we're seeing now, is this tremendous increase in brain tumors in this country, which is completely unexplained by the neurological profession.
There is also a methyl group which is found in all fruits and vegetables. Everything that we eat has methyl groups.
When the body metabolizes, when it breaks down aspartame, you wind up with a small amount of methanol, which is wood alcohol. That in turn is broken down into formaldehyde, which the body cannot get rid of, the body stores. Now the industry has made a big deal about supposedly the fact, it's not really a fact, but what they claim is that when you take in fruit, you take in more methanol. They don't